Unanswered questions about Jason and Voorhees. Number 1.
Who's all buried in Eternal Peace Cemetery? Besides the obvious, Jason, let's go on to the next biggest name, Pamela Voorhees. I'll throw up the screenshot right here if you remember the only time we see Pamela Voorhees' grave in the final chapter. We do know it's somewhere around the Camp Crystal Lake area, but we also know that this cemetery is really close to Camp Crystal Lake, which is now named Camp Forest Green. Side by side, it doesn't look like the same place. But then again, it's been a couple of years since the final chapter has happened. Is Pamela's grave on another section, on the outskirts of it? I mean, Camp Crystal Lake and the surrounding areas is pretty small. I'm sure they're not going to have multiple cemeteries. I could be wrong, but logistically, they don't need them. But now let's move on to victims. Who all could be buried at Eternal Peace Cemetery? If you go through the victims of the franchise, most of them wasn't around the Camp Crystal Lake. They didn't live there. There wasn't a resident. So when their bodies are found, most likely they'll be shipped back home. So if we do have some victims that's close to Camp Crystal Lake, aka Camp Forest Green, let's try to figure out who they are. Barry and Claudette, the camp counselors. Hard to say. We have absolutely no backstory for them. Again, if we're not breaking the fourth wall of the films, we're not looking for answers elsewhere. So them, possibly. Annie, no, she was traveling. There's no way. Ned, Jack, Marcy, and Brenda, I don't think so. They also traveled to get there. Steve Christie, I would say yes. He was familiar with the locals. He dumped all his time and money into that camp. He had to have been a resident there close by. Also, Pamela says that she's a friend of the Christies.
I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
So the Christie family definitely lives around there. Steve's there. Bill Brown, I don't think so. Pamela Voorhees, I would like to think Pamela is there in the vicinity, unless somebody just threw the bitch on the side of the road. Say, here. And just said, yeah, bury the bitch over there. Alice Hardy, absolutely not. She was from California.
No, I may have to go back to California to straighten.
Crazy Ralph, absolutely. Deputy Winslow, maybe. I know his job was to patrol the lake. But then again, if you remember, he was state police. So he had a lot more jurisdiction than just that area. So that's a possibility. Scott, no. Terry, no. Mark Jarvis, maybe. Again, that begs the question if Mark Jarvis is related to the Jarvis family. We may never know. He's a possibility. Sandra Dyer, no. Rob came looking for her, so they definitely do not reside around this area. Vicky, nah. Harold and Edna, I'd say yes. Their store/diner there, so close to Higgins Haven, which is by the lake. They're definitely there. The bikers, Fox, Loco, and Ali, I'd say no. Them being bikers like to travel. The only way they're buried there is they have no former residents and they don't have a place to call home. They could be there, but it's a long shot. Vera, no. We see her picked up by the group in part 3. She's definitely not there. Deborah, no. Andy, no. Sheldon, no. Charles and Chili, no. Rick Bombay, yes. Just going off the story of him and Chris, how he was there for multiple summers. He's very familiar with the area, the Higgins Haven area. Very familiar with the Higgins family. Given the history there, he's definitely there. Okay, the final chapter victims, let's go. Axel and Nurse Morgan. Given how we never truly even figure out if the bodies were found, they was reported as missing. You can't bury a corpse if you don't have a corpse. Now I know some people get buried and have funerals with no bodies, which really confuses me. So I'm gonna say no. I don't believe their bodies were ever found. Hitchhiker? Nah, she was hitchhiking. She doesn't belong there. Again, the only way she is there is if she doesn't have a place to go. She has no family. If she's literally a drifter, a desperado. Samantha? No. Paul? No. Terry? No. Tracy Jarvis? I'd say yes. Considering how close the Jarvis residence is to Camp Crystal Lake, there's definitely a greater possibility of yes than no. So I'm gonna say yes. Jimbo? Dead fuck. No. Teddy Bear? No. Doug? No. Sarah? No. Rob Dyer? No. Again, they traveled to go there to stay. The group of friends rented the cabin out. They're not from there. They're not going to be buried in this cemetery. Now, this is where things get complicated because we don't know how close Pinehurst is to the original Camp Crystal Lake. We assume it's close. We don't know that for a fact. I've always pictured Pinehurst being a few counties away. Considering how they have their own law enforcement, EMT, their own hospital, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that none of these victims are buried here. At least one county, if not multiple counties away. So that includes Joey Burns, no. Vincent, no. Peter, no. William, no. Lana, no. Raymond, no. Not me. The Drifter. Tina, no. Edward, no. Dr. Matt, no. George Winters, no. Anita, no. Demon, no. Junior, no. Ethel, no. Jacob, no. Robin, no. Violet, no. Duke, no. Roy Burns, who gives a fuck? And last but not least, we have Alan Hawes, who we know is buried in there because the drunk-ass caretaker buries him.
Some folks have a strange idea of entertainment.
Number 2.
What's the real story behind these books? Now, for the longest time when I watched Jason Lives, I always thought these books were props. It turns out they're actual books. And spoiler alert, things get pretty weird when you read these books. So you see these 3 books right here that Tommy picks out. And for a small moment, we'll go over the books. But for me, it kind of begs the question why even pick up these books. This is a blink and you miss a moment. If you reach over and grab popcorn to eat, you'll miss this. It also makes me question the significance of the books. But I digress. Let's go over these books. Number 1, A Manual of Occultism. I'll throw up some screenshots of the opening pages right here. Sorcery has been called magic, but magic is wisdom, and there is no wisdom in sorcery. The occultist is one who intelligently and continuously applies himself to the understanding that hidden forces in nature and to the laws of the interior world. You can freeze frame these and read them if you want. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but some of this stuff is really bizarre to me, and it's really hard for me to understand and read. Then again, I'm not versed in this kind of stuff like astrology, which it gets into some astrology sciences as well. If you can explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old child, that would be great. So this is the first book Tommy looks at. And ultimately, it's believed that he used these books to find his answer about how to defeat Jason. Which, I mean, you can just chalk it up to simply, he has to be buried in Camp Crystal Lake to return to his resting place. But I can also argue against that because if his dumbass would have never went there and dug up Jason Voorhees in the first place, none of this would have happened. I think Jason was nice and cozy, just the way it was. Here's the table of contents for this occult book. You have some astrology, talk about marriage, traveling, friends and enemies, the measure of time, numerology, crystal gazing, dreams, the tarots, all kinds of stuff. Now again, forgive me because I'm not well versed in this, but I did flip through some of these pages to find little bitty pieces that does have anything to remotely do with f***ing Jason. Because this is talking about some outlandish shit. And I do mean no offense, just I don't understand some of this stuff. But next, let's talk about the dead or alive. Now this is a little bit more grounded, as something my dumb ass can understand. Here's a picture of the table of contents. And some of these relate to the idea that Tommy had. For instance, voices from beyond, dealing with the earthbound, spiritual messages on tapes, evidences of spirit return, an amazing demonstration of psychic mediumship, dimensions of life beyond life, the continuity of life, your preparation for the life to come. Now again, I didn't read these books front to back, but it seems like this one has way more to do with the situational things that are happening within the Friday the 13th universe, the almost supernatural lore that fuels all these theories. This book is mainly about this girl named Wilma, who had passed away in 1974, and goes on to tell a story about AJ, her husband, trying to communicate with her from beyond the dead. Eventually he meets up with the team, and as time goes by, he eventually hears his wife's voice. Now I consider this to be more of a Amityville horror, a haunting in Connecticut kind of thing, but it does somewhat have something to do with Jason coming back to life, his spirit going back to his body, I guess, and reviving from the dead. So let's talk about the last one, 30 Years Among the Dead. Here is the table of contents for that. The invisible world, higher spirit realms, obsession, insanity, spirit communication, physical research, tormenting spirits, spirits and crime. This book takes a more scientific approach to how spirits and the realms combine here. And I'll throw up this page again, you can read this if you want to. The reality of an invisible world surrounding the physical world is, for many, difficult to comprehend, since the mind sphere is often limited to the visible and tangible. So do these books apply to Tommy's theory about how to defeat Jason? I'd say yes and no. I personally don't really comprehend the science behind astrology. I'm not versed on the afterlife, about the study of the planets and all that. But I do find it kind of cool that it tries to explore and tries to explain what the Friday the 13th supernatural universe element is. Throughout the first couple of the films, you can tell that something supernatural is going on. Whether that be Jason coming back to life, or maybe Jason never even drowned. How Jason is seemingly immortal, and he keeps coming back time and time again. How Pamela can influence Jason to keep on going and keep on killing. Whether that's a supernatural aspect, or if it's all just in his mind. So my final thoughts are, did these books help Tommy in any way? I never saw a direct answer of having to put Jason back in his resting place. But then again, I didn't read the books all the way. But I do feel like Tommy could have figured this out all on his own. I know for a fact this man didn't read all 3 of these books front to back. So what do you think, chat? Did these books really explain the mystery behind Jason Voorhees? And the supernatural lore that is in the Friday the 13th universe? You decide.
Number 3!
Does Jason have regeneration powers? Now this being the Friday franchise, continuity is definitely not the strong point. but I do believe that this is the last film that you can really tie in to make it all make sense. From 7, 8, 9, and 10 forward, I have my f***ing work cut out for me. If I have to explain this without breaking the fourth wall, one thing that caught my eye, pun intended, is Jason's right eye. If you remember throughout the franchise, that eye was f***ed up. I mean, it was f***ed. I mean, it was so f***ed, you can empty the lubricant and put super glue in it and be permanently f***ed. We can see that in part 2, but even if you chalk that up to being a dream sequence, okay, let's move on to part 3. See, in part 3, the eye's kind of f***ed. We move on to part 4, same thing. His right eye, out of service. Which brings me back to this film. We know Jason lost his left eye at the ending of the final chapter with a machete that impales him through his orbital socket, so that's not coming back. His bad eye became his good eye. Now I have a few other things to back this theory. Next on the list is Jason's hand. Remember how it got split in half?
I'm halved! I'm cut in half pretty bad.
Nowhere do we see any kind of scar or that split being there. Granted, Jason does put on the gloves and wears them throughout the duration of the film. If you see this picture right here, we can clearly see that gash ain't there. I guess you could argue that somebody stitched it up, like the coroner or something, fix up his body before putting him down 6 feet. But another thing that's cool, as many times as I've watched this film, I've never noticed Jason has hair in this film. I never knew that. He didn't have hair in the final chapter, so that means he was down there growing some damn hair, but yet his body is decomposed. You just don't fix your eyeball and grow some hair if you don't have some regenerational powers. Now we know this to be true further in the franchise. It's even stated in Jason X, but that's way out there. We'll get there when we get there. So what do you think, guys? Is Jason Voorhees secretly an X-Man?
What the f?
Where is Tommy's father? Now the only reason I bring this up is that this is the end of the Jarvis trilogy, the last chapter of his story. So I'm not going to backtrack too much because I kind of touched on this in parts 4 and 5. And I'm not going to beat the where's Trish Jarvis angle in your face. But we know that she's out of the picture. Tommy was probably way too far gone. She says, okay, wash my hands with it. Is this what you want to do with your life? I got to move on. So the only other family Tommy's got left is the father. Now the opening scene, which I'll play right here.
If the institution ever found out about this, they would haul our butts back in and straight check them.
You didn't have to come, Hawes. This is between me and Jason.
That conversation leads me to believe that they didn't escape the institution, that they're out on their own free will. Now I'm not saying they're released, but it also doesn't seem like they're trying to go incognito. It seems to me that they're out on a weekend pass or something. Because for the most part, despite Tommy's large amount of paranoia in this film, it seems like this version of Tommy Jarvis is well put together compared to part 5. Now we know that Tommy still has hallucinations, which is said by Alan right here.
Seeing his corpse ain't gonna stop the hallucinations.
Seeing it won't, but destroying it will.
But for the most part, it seems like Tommy has dialed down. Now I'm pretty sure in this film, Tommy is 18 years old. Because in part 5, he was 17 years old. Because 5 years had passed since the final chapter. And this small little detail in part 5 says that part 5 actually takes place in October of 1989. Jason Lives should take place a year after, so this is 1990. So he's now a full-grown man in the eyes of the law in most states. So throughout Tommy's journey, between 4 and 5, the 5 years that have passed, and another year after the massacre at Pinehurst, where has Mr. Jarvis been? Tommy still being a minor in all this, until this film, the father would have to take on the parental role. So was it Tommy's dad that made the decision to keep Tommy in the institution? Is Mr. Jarvis that much of a deadbeat? Did he lose faith in his son? Or was he a supporting father that we never saw behind the scenes? Even after the events of this movie and Jason Lives, maybe Tommy can ride off into the sunset with Megan. But back to my question, where is Tommy's father?
Ooh, baby. Ooh, baby.
How do these morons believe that Jason is an urban legend? Now back in my day, my old age, and believe me, I'm a lot older than I look, an urban legend was a story that was passed down from generation to generation. It's been less than 10 years. Matter of fact, it's only been 6 years since the massacre at Packanack, Higgins Haven, and the Jarvis residence. This is 6 years later. Not 20, not 30, not 40, 6 years. And they talk about Jason as if he's some kind of mythical being, a creature, an urban legend.
You mean the Jason of Camp Blood?
I thought Jason was just a legend.
Just because our parents keep telling us that Jason was only a legend doesn't mean it wasn't true. What if he did come back here?
Why are they talking about Jason like he's a fairy tale? Bitch, he's buried in a cemetery. It just baffles me that we're 6 films in, and they're still talking about Jason as if this thing happened a lifetime ago. Like this man was in his grave, how he was identified as Jason Voorhees, put in the grave, somebody made him a tombstone, He has a permanent resting spot, but yeah, he's some kind of urban legend. What's your fucking problem? Like, Jason didn't kill almost 40 people 6 years ago. And that's not including the Pinehurst massacre, which happened in a different area, but still revolved around the Jason persona. And Pinehurst happened last year. Look out! Number 6. Does Jason remember Tommy? Now, most people would just say yes, and that's probably the answer. But for the first time rewatching this film, I actually try to look at this through Jason's eyes. Or eye joke, you know? Whatever, fuck it. If you think about it, the last thing Jason remembers is this. Because he's been down in a hole. So all these years that have passed, Jason has no recollection. Pinehurst didn't happen to him. This being 6 years later, Tommy's no longer that little boy who psyched him out with a fucked up haircut. He's not 12 years old anymore. He's a man now, a full-grown man. I really wonder if Jason put one and one together. After the lightning strike, Alan does say Tommy's name.
Tommy, would you just leave that thing alone?
Now I can only assume Jason knew Tommy's name because of this scene here in part 4.
Tommy, you were supposed to leave!
I think Jason's smart enough to put that together. If that's not enough, Megan also shouts out Tommy's name near the climax of the movie.
Tommy! Get out of there!
Now believe it or not, Tommy is absent through most of this movie. While Jason carries out his massacre during the day with the paintballers, all the way at nighttime with the counselors, Tommy's not there. He's getting prepared to go fight Jason when he's not in jail. So what do you think? At what point did Jason realize that this was the same person that whooped his ass 6 years ago? Because again, to Jason, this wasn't 6 years ago. It was yesterday.
Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ.
Is Tommy driving Pam's truck? Now there's only very little, and I mean very little, in this film that references anything to do with part 5. Only perhaps this truck. Now I've talked about this before, but I'll throw up a side-by-side comparison of the trucks right here. I mean, everything's almost identical. A lot of people seem to believe these trucks are actually 2 different colors. But in fact, that's not true. The greenish tint of Jason Lives is actually just a color timing and color grading. If you push the blues up ever so slightly, you get the exact same color. This is also true for the nighttime shot, even down to the tires. Now, we will never know what truly happened at the end of part 5. We can only assume that Tommy came to his senses and actually did not attack Pam. Because if he did, he'd be locked away and threw under the fucking jail right now. Now, I'm really not a fan of backtracking, so I'm not going to get into the whole mystery of what happened to Pam and what happened to Reggie. And plus, I try to keep these questions as unique as possible, like I really do. But if you remember in my last video when I did cover part 5, I know a lot of people who don't consider this movie canon. By this movie, I mean part 5. But I beg to differ. And the only reason why I consider part 5 canon is probably this truck. If you think about it, it's really the only link we have to part 5. We have no mention of Pam. We have no mention of Reggie. We have no mention of Pinehurst, the victims, Roy Burns. None of that is mentioned. The events of last year, because part 5 takes place a year before this, it is hush hush, swept underneath the rug, took out in the backyard, covered it in gasoline, and burned the fuck up. Like, they do not mention this film inside Jason Lives. So I always thought that this truck was the only tie-in, the only clue, the only reference to part 5. So what do you think? Is this Pam's truck? Is this the only tie-in to part 5? Or is it just a really bizarre coincidence? Number 8. How did Tommy know where Jason's grave was? How did he know Jason had a grave? I find it almost comical about the whole part 5 cremation scene. Okay, and as dumb as the idea is, you have to assume that Tommy believed the same thing in part 5. That was the general consensus, right? The mayor was talking about it, Sheriff Tucker was talking about it, and if they're talking about that in private, that has to be the general information to the public. So during the events of part 5, Tommy had to believe that Jason was in fact cremated.
Were you there? Did you see him cremated?
I'm wondering at what point, previous during the opening scene of this film with Tommy and Alan, did he find out about Jason's grave? I'm more curious to know about how he found out Jason was buried rather than him finding out where it was. Him finding out where it was is pretty self-explanatory. It's right there at Camp Crystal Lake, aka Camp Forest Green. And during the opening scene, he's actually looking for the grave. Like, he's going around with a flashlight and sitting there looking for the grave. Tommy doesn't talk to a whole lot of people. We've established that he doesn't talk to his family. Mama Jarvis is gone. She's Daddy Jarvis evidently isn't in the picture that we know of. It's not like Tommy has a bunch of pen pals he writes to. I mean, he's in a mental institution. So at what point did he find out that Jason was actually buried at Eternal Peace Cemetery? Which brings me back to my previous point of why everybody at Camp Forest Green treats Jason like a fairy tale, like an urban legend. This man is legit right there in the fucking grave. I mean, it's marked for you. There's a sign. Jason Voorhees. What institute did Tommy go to after Pinehurst? I mean, Pinehurst was a joke anyway. If you watched my last video, you know my thoughts on that. The system of Pinehurst had no guards. You're your own boss. An honor system. Yeah, bullshit, motherfucker. So I imagine now that Tommy is in a better institution with more security because the fear of going back is there. We see it with Alan when he says this.
They would haul our butts back in and straitjacket them.
So whatever institute they're in, we know they're not afraid to throw motherfuckers in straitjackets and lock them in a padded room. Which also makes me believe that there's very limited resources of media coming in. Limited restrictions on communication with Tommy to the outside world. So during the events of part 5, if the general consensus was that Jason was cremated, how did Tommy know that Jason was buried? Number 9! What is it with these dudes' hairline in this movie? I mean, Jesus Christ, I know male pattern baldness is a real thing, a real struggle, and it's not to be taken lightly. But I mean, you can ride a skateboard off that thing. And what is this? And on the left, I mean, like, what is going on? Like, you have a full head of hair, but back here. I mean, even this dude has a hatred for women.
Dumb broad. She should have stayed in the kitchen where she belongs.
And 10. Did Tommy take the fall for the massacre? So one thing we know for sure is that for whatever reason, Jason's body is still there in part 7, which we will explore that in the next video. But at this point, everybody's dead, right? The only surviving counselor is Megan, which Megan is a G. She took down Jason, not Tommy. Tommy chained him, I'll give him that, but it was Megan that took that man down. But what about all the kids? And these kids are pretty fucking funny. Yeet! Yeet! But this is the only film up to this point where you have a large group of kids who witnessed what happened. Now I imagine Tommy isn't out of the woods yet, literally. We know Jason's body was never recovered down there. So we know police never went into the water, which I won't deep dive into that until we go to part 7. So considering that fact that Jason's still down there after all these years, who's left to take the fall for the massacre? It could have been Jason. I mean, it could have been, but if you consider part 7 canon, it doesn't make sense. So I have a small theory here. What if Tommy willingly took the fall for this massacre and convinced the kids to never ever talk about this under any circumstances? Because he knew if somebody disturbed Jason's final resting place, that it would start all over again. So maybe those books in the beginning actually did give Tommy some insights about not only what to do to Jason, but about after the fact as well. Because throughout the rest of the franchise, we never see Tommy again. He's never even mentioned again. Maybe because he's hiding. Maybe at this point, it is his life's goal to keep that promise. And to put his trust in the other kids. It's like, hey, never mention this. Because if somebody disturbs Jason, he's going to be back. So even though she doesn't want to, I imagine Megan goes along with this. The sheriff's daughter, right? Witnessed the whole thing. The kids saw the whole thing. They all come into agreement that, hey, we can never tell anybody about this. This is the way it's got to be. So Tommy takes the fall. Megan is the sole survivor. The sheriff's daughter, who saved the kids from Tommy, and by the time any more law enforcement got there, Tommy was gone. He's probably on the FBI's most wanted list. And the kids go along with it because they have to take this to their grave. Because even though they're kids, they understand the responsibility of, hey, if somebody disturbs Jason again, more people are going to die. So is that why we never see Tommy Jarvis again? Because he fled the state, fled the country, sacrificing the rest of his life to make sure Jason never haunts the shores of Camp Crystal Lake ever again. Wild theory, but that's the only explanation I have. They didn't blame Jason because Jason's in the water the whole time. They're just like, leave him there, boy. He'll be alright. I mean, unless you have a different theory of why Jason's body was never recovered, drop it down in the comments. But I don't think it's coincidence that we never see Tommy again after this. You know why? Because he took the blame and got the fuck out of Dodge. So that's going to wrap this video up, guys. Thank you so much for taking part of your day to kick with me. You know, I appreciate it. I love you all. Until next time, when I see you in the New Blood, part 7, that's going to be tough. Because 7, 8, 9, and 10, continuity's fucked. But until next time, guys, I love you all. See you in the next one. Adios.